what is interesting is once you start to sort of combine these things, you're sort of even further sort of reinforcing relationships. So here we have proximity plus color, rotation plus color. It's even stronger. Not stronger, that's not even a word, but it's even more readily apparent that these sort of belong together. Where things really get interesting is when we start to have interesting artistic choices that come from sort of understanding and reinforcing relationships between spaces and then choosing to break them in meaningful ways. So the player's attention is directed toward the dissonance in these patterns. So here we have a grouping of shapes that are sort of, or spaces that are all along the same rotation, they're the same shape, they're enclosed together, and then we have this circular object that sort of stands out, or this orange object that stands out from the rest, or this object that is not on the same sort of grid structure as these. And that sort of brings this sort of in focus as far as a sort of a focal element of the space. So in this sort of top-down view of a scene, there's a clear dominant pattern here represented by building rotations. So most of these buildings are aligned on sort of a north-south and east-to-west grid. But as you can see, there's sort of a second pattern here at odds with that dominant pattern seen by these buildings here. So we have this this second pattern here, and this is what we call a dissonant pattern. Sort of, it is not in harmony with the others and sort of stands out, and really kind of hits home the fact that these structures right here belong to a recognizable group. These structures over here are part of a recognizable group. It breaks sort of the monotony of, if these were all in the same sort of grid pattern, it would feel like there's not really any sort of recognizable sort of cadence between each of these spaces. So this is kind of what creating these dissonant patterns does. It draws attention to them and also draws attention to the identity of these spaces, the fact that they can be picked out from the spaces around them. And by notching this building right here, it creates sort of a sympathetic interaction with here, a connection across the space that might lead the player from one space to another as they explore here and they come out. If a door that might be here, they recognize that this is aligned with the space that they're in, and it feels related, and it feels like you can be drawn over here. Another advantage of sort of breaking from a dominant grid like this is that it allows us to create an oblique angle in how the player will sort of encounter this particular wall right here. So using oblique approaches is a sort of powerful way of giving the player more spatial information about a part of your level. So I wanted to give sort of an example of that. If we have kind of a building here, seeing it from the front is very impressive. But it sort of gives almost the least amount of information here about the sort of what this wall's 3D information is. If we were to look at it from a side, you could see how parts of this building are stretching out from it. But if you were to sort of compare that to the, as I called it, sort of the oblique angle, you can see there's a lot more sort of detail of like understanding that the space that can go into like these rooms here and how this brick structure sort of sticks out. And if we combine that with even more, I guess, this is sort of an oblique low angle, and this is an oblique high angle. As you can see, the difference here we have sort of an oblique angle on sort of two axes, which is giving even more information about the structure. So, creating sort of the entrance into a space on sort of an elevated position like this gives you a lot more 3D information about the structure here. Going back to our grid dissonant pattern example, there's also another major pattern here. This example is taken from the orient to path map that I had created earlier, and so as you can see here, there is a sort of a there is a path structure here, and that's sort of the dominant. That's another sort of pattern at work here that's describing like how these shapes sort of relate to each other. And here in this this open area here in the middle, we have this, as I described it, a sympathetic interaction between these two walls here. We also have sort of this fork in the road, and it really brings a lot of sort of focus here, and especially this seems like a good place to sort of lay down kind of a maybe a broken wagon or something like that at this juncture, and sort of layering these interactions makes for a an interesting space that brings a lot of focus to this area, if that was my intention. So more on defying the pattern. Here's an example of symmetry. So I often see pretty strict adherence to symmetry in work from novice designers. Symmetries, as I was saying earlier, often used by architects in spaces that are meant to feel impressive, like churches, grand entries, lobbies, museums. And designers, especially designers that feel like they need to prove something, want to make their spaces feel impressive too, so often see sort of an exploration or combat space like this. But the trouble is that symmetry is also very boring. So as you sort of explore into a space, once you see one level, you've seen the other, so there's not really any necessarily reason for exploring one side for the other. At least here in this particular example, the pattern's broken by slightly different shaped buildings on each side, but still the overall sort of pattern remains, so that it is an improvement on it as opposed to if these were sort of identical halves. If this were a combat space, though, I guess depending on if we were going to these buildings or not, you would end up with sort of like, okay, if the combat was coming from the top and you were coming from down here, you end up with less meaningful choices, because essentially this is the same choice going left, or the same choice going left versus going right, as opposed to if this was not a symmetrical space, you would have sort of a strategic difference between one side versus the other. So breaking or defying a pattern that is very strong like symmetry can make a bold and very interesting statement. So for example, if we put in some foliage here, it might obscure the buildings to the right, putting more focus sort of on this left side. It also masks the symmetry, making it less obvious. It's more of something that can be discovered by the player as opposed to sort of beaten over their head, and that makes for a much more satisfying interaction with the space. Or if we were maybe to put in a bunch of wreckage sort of on this this left side, sort of blocking the pathway here. Now the symmetry sort of is completely broken, as far as like if we were just looked at the footprint of the space, it's not a very symmetrical space as far as the actual usable space. It's actually this kind of very interesting sort of pathway here. But because the underlying principle of the space is symmetry, and this comes across to the player, the symmetry sort of assists in helping the player understand this very complex space quicker. And it also begs the question, I guess, is there anything behind this wreckage? So as I explore here, and I understand that this is a symmetrical space, it sort of begs the question, is there sort of another space over here? So this might be a good place for like a secret or something like that.